So I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. The theme for our reception and fundraiser this year is Supersurvivors. As many of you saw on the invitation, we have a special guest speaker tonight who is the author of a book, Supersurvivors. And it's very fitting for our agency, CARA, because our agency, CARA, is all about hope and healing and bringing others who are traveling around loss and grief, giving them hope in the world on a daily basis. So we're excited to have tonight a special guest speaker. So the program, just so you all know, David Feldman will speak with us for about 30 minutes. I told him even though we started a little late, he still gets his full 30 minutes. But I do believe it'll be very inspiring. If you've read the book, you'll know it's a very powerful book about the human spirit. After David, we have a special auctioneer named Franco Finn, who is the hype man for our one and only Golden State Warriors. And Franco will inspire you to give money to support our cause. That's what he promised me. And you know, I just want to thank you for your participation today. I know we've got a lot of folks that came out on a day. There's a lot of things going on in the neighborhood. There's a calendar that's full of other fundraisers and other activities, and so I thank you for coming out to support CARA. Whether you did the wine toss or whether you do a gift of $10,000 to the fund in need, so I really thank you. Your gift and your participation empowers our mission of providing grief support for the community. Our guiding value is empathy. Our desire is for people to know us before they meet us. Our work is about delivering hope daily. So I'm super excited that you're here today. I'm super excited that if it's your first time, you get to learn about CARA a little bit. And I'm super excited if it's the 20th to 30th time you've been here that you're still supporting us. My name is Jim Santucci. I always forget to introduce myself, so sorry. So my name is Jim Santucci, and I've been serving as the Executive Director for CARA since the fall of 2013. My story is I was a client for CARA back in 2008. I matriculated to a volunteer, matriculated to a staff, matriculated to Executive Director. I'm not sure what the next thing is, but there'll be something on the screen tonight, and you can figure out what the next thing might be. But right now I'd like to introduce David Feldman. And I can't wing my introduction on David because he's too important. David Feldman, PhD, is an Associate Professor of Counseling Psychology at Santa Clara University. Everyone knows Santa Clara University, and if you don't, you should. He's the author of 3 books, including The End-of-Life Handbook, A Compassionate Guide to Connecting with and Caring for a Dying Loved One. Interestingly enough, his book was on one of our mantelplaces in our office as I was doing some moving things around the other day. So we have his book as a reference source in our library. Of course, his book he'll be talking about tonight is Supersurvivors. His research and writings address such topics as hope, meaning, and growth in the face of life's difficult circumstances. Sounds like CARA, doesn't it? Dr. Feldman has written for the Huffington Post and Psychology Today, been interviewed in Self, U.S. News and World Report, and Ode, among others, and has had his work featured in WebMD and About.com. I'm really appreciative of David's ability to come up and speak with us today. So, David, without further ado, thank you.
So let's see if the technology works. Up there is supposed to be my first slide. Yay! So that's the book in question. And I am thrilled to be here to talk with you about what really amounts to a journey. A journey that I and my co-author in writing Supersurvivors had the fortune of taking during the last 5 years or so. It's a journey that involved hundreds and hundreds of conversations with people who had suffered from some of the worst traumas and losses that you can possibly imagine. It's a journey that also took us into the pages of scientific journals to look at the research about trauma and trauma survival and resilience. It's a journey that took us into the sort of darkest places in people's lives, and it's a journey that took us into stories of resilience and growth and meaning in the face of pretty dark times. And so I hope to share with you some of those stories today. A little bit of my background. I had spent, prior to writing this book, something like 20 years of my life studying how people overcome really difficult times in their life. I had done therapy with people who had lost loved ones and people who had been in combat and people who were dealing with lots and lots of other, of some of the worst traumas you can imagine. But truly the inspiration for this particular book was one woman. This is her. This is Asha Mevlana, and her story is sort of the story that launched 1,000 stories for my co-author and I. Her story starts when she was 24 years old. And she was living a pretty good life. She was living in New York City. She had an apartment in Soho. She was making a six-figure salary. She worked in business. She worked in marketing. She liked her job, or at least she thought that she liked her job. She was living a good life. But I think it's fair to say it was a sort of unchallenged life. It was the life of a 24-year-old. She hadn't really thought much about life, even though that she was pretty happy. And then the unthinkable happened, something that should not happen to anyone at the age of 24. She was in the shower, and she noticed a rather large lump under her left breast. And so she went to the doctor, and she says she remembers sitting in that cold exam room with the med tech examining her. And she said that she didn't need the med tech or her doctor to tell her the cold truth of what she was facing. She had breast cancer. Now, we like to think, erroneously I might add, we like to think that breast cancer is kind of no big deal. I know you know better than that. It's a very big deal for everybody, and particularly for someone who's 24 years old. She had a very virulent form of breast cancer, a very fast-growing form. And although the doctors were optimistic about her chances of survival, she honestly thought that she was going to die at 24 years old. Pretty tough story. So we wanted to get to know her, and we got to know lots of people like her. And one of the questions that we asked all of them is, what was the hardest part for you? What was the hardest part of your journey through your trauma? And what she said for her, it wasn't finding the lump in her breast. It wasn't being diagnosed with cancer. It wasn't even the months and months of chemotherapy. It wasn't watching her hair fall out. It wasn't feeling nauseated or watching her body wither under the chemotherapy drugs. It also wasn't thinking that she was going to die. Those for her, although very hard, were not the hardest parts. What she said was the hardest part was finding out that she was cancer-free, which was an odd answer. And so we asked her more about that, and she said that the hardest part was when the doctor told her that the chemotherapy had worked and she should go back to her life as normal. And so she tried. She really, really tried. She tried to go back to her office and back to her work. She tried to care about the stuff she once cared about. I see people shaking their heads who may have been through this. She tried to care about the water cooler conversations with her colleagues, gossiping about whatever's going on at the office, or the latest Starbucks that opened down the street, or the latest episode of Survivor and what happened. But try as she might, she just couldn't get back into her life. It just seemed so empty, given what she had faced and gone through. And so she knew she needed to find a way of changing it. As she put it, she needed to find a way of dropping out of this life and into another one, is what she told us. She didn't know how. So of all things, she started taking improvisational violin lessons. Now, like a lot of us, she took music when she was a kid. She took violin lessons. But she wasn't very good at it. But her new teacher took a really different tack with her. her new teacher said, look, don't worry about playing beautifully. Don't worry about being a technical virtuoso. Instead, just play through your pain. Make the violin speak the suffering and the pain that you went through with your ordeal with cancer. And so she did. And she found this experience compelling. She found it meaningful. She found it felt important to her. And so she wanted to do it. She wanted to do it more. She wanted to do it more. So, being not very good at the violin, this is the electric violin, by the way, she started to play with some amateur rock bands in New York City, just around New York. And she really enjoyed it. It was a new kind of way of expressing herself. And then one day, a friend of a friend of a friend, I think, attended a concert that she played at. And this friend of a friend of a friend was from Los Angeles and came up to her afterwards and said, you might be able to get some paying gigs if you move to LA. And so Asha did something that she said she never would have done before her cancer ordeal. She decided to take a chance. And she moved her entire existence to Los Angeles without a job and without a clue really about what she was going to do. And she struggled for a while, and she worked hard. And a few months later, her violin had broken in a minor way, and she ended up going into a repair shop. And the guy behind the counter said to her that Dee Snider, I don't know if you know that name, the lead singer of Twisted Sister, remember them? Was auditioning electric violinists for his latest tour. And so she thought, oh, what the heck? And she tried out, and 6 months later, she celebrated her birthday on board the tour bus of one of the greatest acts of all time, at least in my opinion. Now, one thing sort of led to another, and there was a lot of hard work involved, too. She ended up playing with people like Alanis Morissette. She ended up playing with Jay-Z. She ended up on The Tonight Show. And then she ended up landing a permanent, or at least a regular position on the American Idol band. Her own band, Porcelain, which I am told is really big in Australia, ended up being signed to Universal Records, the mega record company. Now, Asha's story is by no means typical. Not at all. It's an unusual and rare story, a dramatic story. But I'm going to make the case as we go through in the next 20 minutes or so that we can learn a lot from these kinds of unusual stories about how to live our own lives, given the things that all of us face in life. I mean, the fact is, Asha is not alone in her trauma experience. Something like 60 to 80% of us during our lives will face a serious life-threatening trauma. That's a statistic that is so high that the first time I heard it years and years ago, I really almost didn't want to believe it. Yet, I assure you it's based on really solid epidemiological studies with tens of thousands of participants across the US and also abroad. 60 to 80%. And we're not talking about minor traumas here. We're talking about things like cancer, natural disasters, victimization and assault, physical abuse. And this doesn't count the normal setbacks and stresses that we all experience on a daily basis. And I think particularly important for this audience and for the work that Kara does, that doesn't count the losses we experience either. I mean, I don't think I need to tell you that 100% of us during our lives will lose people, probably multiple people that we love and love dearly. So given these high statistics, I think it would be easy to fall into a sort of cynicism or pessimism about the whole thing, to say, well, life just sucks, and there's not much we can do about it. It's just the human condition. And to get angry, or to get anxious, or to become depressed. And indeed, a lot of people following trauma and loss do that. Who could blame them? Who could blame them? But I want to hit you with a couple of figures that are perhaps more optimistic. You're all familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? The nightmares and the flashbacks that can visit people after trauma and sometimes loss. Mood symptoms, depression, etc. Serious issue. Deserves serious conversation and serious treatment. But what you may not know is that PTSD only happens in about 17% of cases of trauma. 17%, 17%. So although for that 17%, very serious, it's an amazing fact about human nature that the vast majority of people, after a period of understandable emotional turmoil that you cannot skip over, somehow find a way to recover, to bounce back, to be resilient, to move forward. And sometimes, of course, people do even more. So let me hit you with another statistic that I almost couldn't believe the first time I saw it. 80% of people, according to multiple studies over the last 20 years, 80% of people in the aftermath of trauma grow in some way. 80% of people grow in some way. That doesn't mean they don't suffer, but they also grow. And this can mean lots of things. This can mean deepening in your relationships. It can mean realizing and clarifying what's really important to you, often embracing different goals, different directions, different values for your life. It can mean spiritual growth, deepening in what you believe or your relationship with the divine. It can mean discovering new fonts of personal strength that you didn't know you have. Some of this growth is what you might consider kind of minor from the outside, though very important. Things like seeing the grass as greener, seeing the sky as bluer, appreciating each moment more, being more mindful of the gifts that you still do have. I often hear people say that I now take life one day at a time, and I'm grateful for each day. This is so-called post-traumatic growth. But sometimes there are those rare cases, those unusual cases like Asha, where people don't only grow, they revolutionize their life. They dramatically shift the course of their life, often touching the world around them. And it's those people that we call super survivors in our book. By the way, here's Asha during her cancer ordeal, having lost her hair. And here she is in one of her latest publicity photos. And you can see she has this amazing cleaved red electric violin. If you ever get a chance to go on YouTube and type in her name, and you'll see some amazing performances by her, and an incredibly nice person. Now, obviously, her case and people like her, these super survivors, are unusual. They are rare. But what my co-author and I have sought to do in our studies and in this book is to try to really understand what they have learned. Because I think sometimes we, ordinary people, can learn a lot from these extraordinary stories about how we can live more meaningful and satisfying lives. Because the fact of the matter is, we all face traumas, setbacks, and losses. And so that's part of what I'd like to talk about today. Now, I want to give you a couple of caveats before I continue, because I would never want you to misunderstand my message. Never. There are two things I really hope you'll never misunderstand me as saying. The first thing is that trauma or loss is somehow good. I will never say that. Let me be clear. These are the worst things that I could ever imagine happening to anyone, and I've experienced them myself. There is nothing good about seeing your house destroyed in an earthquake. There is nothing good about being shot at in a war zone. There is nothing good about rape or abuse. There is nothing good about being diagnosed with cancer. There is nothing good about losing someone that you love, whether that's a grandparent or a parent or a spouse or a child. These are absolutely the worst things that can ever happen to anyone in life. And yet they are facts of life. And if I could wave my magic wand and get rid of this kind of suffering, I would, but I can't. And if you have such a magic wand, talk to me after. So I will never celebrate loss or trauma, but I will celebrate today the human spirit, or I guess more precisely, the human psychological system, the human mind's ability to stare suffering in the face and somehow find a way to grow, somehow find a way to be resilient. So trauma and loss bad, but human spirit good. The second thing I would never want you to misinterpret me as saying is that if you don't grow from trauma or loss, that you've done something wrong. I would never want you to think that I'm saying people who haven't grown are somehow less than people who have. I don't think that. My co-author doesn't think that. And actually, none of the super survivors that we interviewed for our book think that either. To be clear, simply living through some of the events that I'm going to talk about is pretty darn super. Nonetheless, for people who do grow, they often consider it one of the most important things that they've done during their whole life, growing. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to ask, what helped them to grow? And is there anything that we want to take for our own lives from their experiences and their stories? And so we interviewed 150 people. Actually, we did over 150 interviews. And we also did this deep dive into 30 years of the scientific research about resilience. And we distilled it into 8 principles that it turns out help people to be resilient and to grow. And I unfortunately, as much as I'd love to tell you all 8, I don't have time tonight. So I'm going to give you one. I'm going to hit you with one of them. And it's a pretty big one. It's a pretty general one. But it's one that sort of threads its way through our book. And my hope is that if it interests you and if it really gets you thinking, that you'll maybe read our book, but that you'll also maybe look up more information on post-traumatic growth, because I think it's an important thing in our lives. And this principle that I want to talk about is called grounded hope. Grounded hope. And I think it has a lot to do with what CARA does as an organization, providing hope to people. Grounded hope is actually a principle that has 25 years of research behind it, going back to 1991, hundreds of research studies that I'll spare you about, but that show that this is a very powerful idea. But again, truly for our book, the reason that we included it was because of one gentleman. This is a guy named Alan Locke, and here he is looking pretty dapper in his suit and tie. Alan's story begins, I guess, when he's around 23 years old. Alan had always dreamed of being in the British Royal Navy. He is British, which is fortunate for him. And he busted his behind when he was a little kid to earn the marks that he needed and to get the experiences that he needed to be a sailor in the British Royal Navy. And by the time he was about 23, he had achieved that. He was an officer in the Navy, and he was stationed aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic Ocean. It was his dream. And even though it was his dream, it was really hard work. So he talks about 18-hour shifts when he first started doing it. And it was during one of those shifts that this story begins. He was on about the 17th hour of his 18-hour shift, and it was in the middle of the night, and he was exhausted. He was exhausted. And he he was helping to navigate, and he had to read some navigational charts, some maps. And he looked down at the maps, and he realized that he couldn't see them very well, that his eyesight was very blurry. He said it almost looked like the ink was smudged and smeared across the page, and yet he knew it wasn't. And so he did what most of us would do. He rubbed his eyes and blinked and looked again, and it was still blurry. And he honestly thought nothing of it, because he'd been up for 18 hours. So he thought, I'll go to sleep, and in the morning, it'll be better. Only in the morning, when he opened his eyes, it wasn't better. His eyesight was blurrier. So he ended up going to the doctor, and the doctor told him something that would change his life forever. The doctor diagnosed him with macular degeneration, which you may know is a condition where the eye disintegrates, degrades little by little by little, often leaving the person legally blind. Not always, but often. Basically, Alan was going blind slowly. Now, this is an illness that often visits people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and he was only 23. Now, he went to his friends, and his friends tried to encourage him. They told him, just think positively. Just put your mind on the positive. Don't allow yourself to think any negative thoughts. Look on the bright side. Look for the silver lining. Everything will be okay. And so Alan tried. He really tried to think positively. he started telling himself, well, maybe the doctor's wrong. Maybe I don't really have macular degeneration. Or maybe it's going to reverse itself. Maybe it'll be okay. But he said, try as he might to think positively, it just wasn't working for him. And all the positive thinking in the world didn't stop the inevitable from happening. And so he told us about the day that he was called into a British government building. He walked down a cold, narrow hallway into a cold, small room, and he was handed a huge stack of papers. And he couldn't read them because his eyesight was so blurry that he could no longer read. The font was too small, but he knew what they said. They were discharge papers. He was being involuntarily discharged from his job in the Navy. So not only had he lost his vision, but he had also lost his dream. And not surprisingly, again, who could blame him? He fell into months and years even of depression and of lots of emotional turmoil. But just for a second, I want to skip to the end of his story, because he goes on to do something really astounding. Alan Locke, a few years later, goes on to be the first blind person to row a rowboat across the Atlantic Ocean. And he now holds a Guinness Book of World Records record, and he has become an inspiration to millions of blind and low-sighted people across the globe. Here he is after his journey from the Spanish Canary Islands to Barbados. Yeah, he could look better, but he was very proud of this. Very proud of this. He also, by the way, became then, more recently, just a couple of years ago, the first blind person ever to trek across Antarctica. Again, winning himself another world record. And he will tell you that he would have never dreamed of doing anything like this had his trauma not happened to him. So again, an astounding and unusual case. And I remember, asking him, how did you do that? Right? Like, that's the question. How did you do that? And how can we learn whatever you have to teach us? And we, in fact, asked this of all of our super survivors. How did you do that? And what was interesting is, Alan said, yeah, I'll tell you how I did it. I'll tell you what helped me. But first, I want to tell you what didn't help me. I want to tell you what wasn't helpful at all. And it was interesting that he's not the only person that said this. Lots of the super survivors that we talked to wanted to tell us advice that they had received that did not help them the least. And so what he told us, and what we heard over and over and over again that didn't help him, was positive thinking. Now, I have to say, at the time, and this was a few years ago, my co-author and I were kind of thrown for a loop about this. Because my co-author and I are both American, and most of you in this room are American or have lived in the US for a long time. And like practically in the DNA of this country is this can-do, positive attitude, right? Just look on the bright side. And so this seemed strange to us. And also I'm a psychologist, and I had been taught that the secret recipe for success and a happy long life and good health, even physical health, was positive thinking. And so I thought, really, could all this be wrong? Could positive thinking really not be what it's cracked up to be? So we asked him specifically, what do you mean by positive thinking here? Because, there can be different definitions of positive thinking. And he told us what he meant. And what he meant turns out to coincide pretty well with the so-called power of positive thinking movement. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about here. It's a movement that has really gone on for about 100 years now. And it's extolled by lots of self-help books and lots of self-help gurus. Oprah has talked about it, and other TV personalities. And this is the notion, the power of positive thinking is the notion that your thoughts create reality. That if you put your mind on positive things and have positive thoughts, that good things will happen to you. And if you put your mind on negative things and have negative thoughts, that bad things will happen to you. And so obviously the strategy is, don't think negative thoughts, push them out of your mind, and really only focus on the positive, and then good things will happen to you. And he said that attitude for him was not at all helpful. And interestingly, he wasn't the only one that found that not helpful. I was speaking at a conference of cancer survivors a couple of years ago. And I was speaking to an audience about like this, but it was about 1,000 people. It was a lot of people. And I asked the audience, as I do sometimes, what is the least helpful thing that anyone said to you during your ordeal with cancer? And of course, there were 1,000 people there, so there were lots of answers. But there was a huge wave of agreement in the audience that one of the least helpful things that they heard was think positively, look on the bright side, every cloud has a silver lining, smile and be happy, and it'll all work out. And so I asked them, well, tell me why. Why isn't that helpful to you? And we asked that to Alan too and to all of our super survivors. And people give two answers. The first answer, why the advice think positively isn't very helpful, is that people say, in the aftermath of the worst possible event that could ever happen in your life, whether that's a trauma or a diagnosis of a terrible illness or a loss, a serious loss of someone you loved, you don't naturally feel like thinking very positively. Look, if you're naturally that positive of a person, that's awesome. That's awesome. But most people are not. And so what we heard was when people try to force themselves to think that way, it just feels like they're lying to themselves. It feels more like denial than true positive thinking. And as we know from the stages of grief, the so-called stages of grief, denial is a normal part of grieving. A normal part of grieving. But you don't want to get stuck there. Because sometimes getting stuck in denial will mean it's harder to move forward. The second reason that people said that positive thinking wasn't terribly helpful to them is that they said sometimes it can cause guilt and self-doubt. And let me tell you about that, because I was really curious about that, and some of the research shows this too, that if you buy into the idea that your thoughts create reality, that positive thoughts create positive things, and that negative thoughts create negative things happening to you, then it can be really easy to blame yourself for negative things that happen, because maybe it's your fault that the trauma happened or that the loss happened. Maybe you created it with your negative thoughts. I don't think that's true. But I think it's easy to fall into that. And a lot of those people at that Cancer Survivors conference that day came up to me afterwards and even hugged me and said, thank you for talking about this, because I fell into months of depression where I blamed myself for my own cancer. Self-blame is common in the aftermath of trauma, cancer, and loss. And very painful. Now look, self-blame might be worth it if positive thinking actually really worked to make you happier and healthier. So I did a lot of reading. I read hundreds of research articles over the last, say, half century on positive thinking, and I was shocked to find out that positive thinking is not all it's cracked up to be. There's some research that shows that people who naturally think positive are a little happier than people who are, say, pessimists or cynics. But there is actually very little, if no research, that links positive thinking with better physical health, with longer life. I know you think you've heard of it. It's not there. It's not there. There is some evidence that people get fewer colds when they are positive thinkers. Look, I'm not saying positive thinking is necessarily always bad, but it's certainly not as powerful as we might hope that it would be. So if positive thinking sort of at best isn't all that helpful, what is helpful? And that's a question that we put to Alan and our super survivors. Okay, so thanks for telling us what didn't help you. What did? And we heard the following answer over and over and over again, and we heard it from Alan. Alan said it wasn't positive thinking, it was realistic thinking. It was realistic thinking, a very unromantic answer, I have to say. And so we wanted to know, what did he mean by that? What do you mean by realistic thinking? And he said, first of all, realistic thinking is not the same as pessimism or cynicism. He said the opposite of positive thinking is not cynical thinking. It's realistic thinking. And he said, realistic thinking has built into it hope. Part and parcel of realistic thinking is hope. He said true hope, in his estimation, is grounded in a realistic understanding of what is happening to you, without denial and without distortion. And so, rather than call this realistic thinking, we actually called Alan's brand of realistic thinking grounded hope. It's a hope grounded in realism. And we asked him to tell us more about it. And as I said, there are about 2.5 decades of research showing the power of grounded hope. But I'm going to use some of Alan's words to explain it. He said that there are 2 parts to grounded hope. There's the grounded part and there's the hope part. And the grounded part, and this is the message that I really want to leave you with tonight, the grounded part is a realistic understanding of one's life situation, a realistic understanding of your life situation. And we heard this over and over and over again. Alan said, for instance, that it was only once he admitted to himself, I lost my vision. I'm not going to get it back. Doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor had told him that he could move on, somehow move forward. It was only once he admitted to himself that he had lost his job, his dream job, and he wasn't going to get it back. Lawyer after lawyer, believe me, he consulted, told him that. It's only once he sort of accepted that he could move forward. And he wasn't the only person that we heard this from. Other super survivors that we talked to, one was a woman that when she was just a girl, she lost her entire family in the genocide in Rwanda about 25 years ago. And she said that she couldn't get on with her life until she first admitted to herself that she had lost the people that she loved. And that she dealt with the pain from that. That she grieved the pain. She grieved their loss. It was only then that she could move forward. We talked to another fellow who, when he was in his late 20s, lost his leg in a terrible car accident. And he said the only way he could move forward was admitting to himself that he had lost his leg and his life was going to change forever. And only then could he then take steps, so to speak, to build his life again. He, by the way, is now one of Hollywood's most sought-after stuntmen, and his specialty is getting his leg blown off. I'm serious. I'm serious. He's an amazing guy. Amazing guy. So start with the idea of a realistic understanding of one's life situation. But Alan said very clearly, it doesn't stop there. That's not where grounded hope stops. This is the beginning of it. This is the first step. But the next step is then, grounded in this realistic understanding, to ask yourself an incredibly simple, yet forward-looking and hopeful question. And that question is, what now? What now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of realistically where I am in my life? Alan said that was his first step along his journey that eventually led across the Atlantic Ocean. Asha said very much the same thing. She said it was only once she admitted to herself that she could not go back to her life the way that it was, that she could ask herself, then how do I need to change my life? What do I need it to look like? And begin to take steps to move towards that future. And I think that there's a lesson in here for all of us, because we all will face traumas and setbacks and serious losses in our life, that when we do, as hard as it is to do, one thing that we can do for ourselves is as compassionately as possible to admit to ourselves the reality of what has happened to us, without painting a smiley face over it, without distorting it, without pretending like there's necessarily a silver lining. And give ourselves the time to grieve and to feel the pain, because I think the only way past grief is through it. But then in the midst of that, to not forget to ask the question, what now? What's next? What can I do now? And to have some little seed of hope that a better future can await. I think that's the message that super survivors were trying to give us in writing the book, and we hope comes across in the book. And I also think it's one of the things that Kara does every day for people, in helping people to deal with grief and loss, to find that grounded hope that there is a future. Thank you.